and he didn't respond after that. I walked back toward the tent and called his name, and there was no answer. So I pulled the flap open. I remember that trip mostly because of how far in we decided to go without really planning it. This was out near Lost Creek Wilderness in Colorado sometime in late August, and it was just me and Ryan. We had gone in thinking we'd stick to one of the marked spots along the trail, but we kept walking past them since they were either occupied or too close to other groups, and after a while, we were far enough in that turning back didn't make sense, so we cut off the trail and found a spot on our own. It wasn't really a clearing, more like a narrow open stretch between trees with a dry creek bed running a few feet off to one side, and the ground there was uneven, but flat enough for a tent if you picked the right spot. And I remember noticing a few old stones placed in a rough circle near the creek, not like a fire ring, more like they had been set down one by one without a clear pattern. And Ryan said it was probably just hikers messing around. We set up before it got dark and didn't bother with a fire since it wasn't that cold, just used a lantern and kept things simple. And for a while, everything felt normal, just quiet in that way it usually gets out there once it's fully dark. At some point, we both started hearing the same thing, but neither of us mentioned it immediately. It was a sound coming from the creek bed, like small rocks shifting one at a time, not rolling, just a single movement, then nothing, then again after a gap, and it kept happening without getting closer or farther, just staying in that same area. After a while, Ryan stood up and walked over to the edge of the creek to check it out, and I stayed back near the tent watching him, and he didn't go all the way down, just stood at the edge looking into it. And then he turned back and said there was nothing there, no animals, nothing moving. He came back and sat down, and the sound stopped for a bit after that, long enough that we both relaxed again, and then it started again. But this time, it wasn't from the creek. It was coming from somewhere behind us, closer than before. And I turned expecting to see something moving through the trees, but there was nothing there. We didn't go looking that time. We just stayed where we were, and after a few minutes, Ryan said he was going to lie down for a bit, so he went into the tent while I stayed outside with the lantern. And I remember sitting there listening to the same pattern of sounds, except now it was moving, not in a straight line, but shifting position in small jumps, like it would be to the left for a while, and then suddenly from the right, without crossing the space between. At some point, I looked toward the creek again, and the stones we had noticed earlier looked different, not in number, but in how they were placed, like they had been nudged slightly out of where they were before, and I wasn't completely sure of it, so I stood up and walked a few steps closer to check. Right when I did that, I heard Ryan speak from inside the tent, asking if I had moved the stones earlier, and I said no, and he didn't respond after that. I walked back toward the tent and called his name, and there was no answer. So I pulled the flap open, and he was there, lying in the same position, but awake, just looking straight up. And he said he thought I had just asked him something from outside, right next to the tent, not from where I had been standing. We didn't stay after that. We packed without talking much and left the lantern behind. neither of us wanted to turn our backs to the trees long enough to grab it. When we reached the main trail again, maybe 15 minutes out, Ryan stopped and said something didn't feel right, and I asked what he meant. And he pointed down at the ground behind us. There was a second set of footprints, following ours in the dirt, close enough that they overlapped in places, but they didn't start from the direction of the campsite. They started somewhere along the path after we had already been walking